cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and sea to the far corners of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of heaven.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
I've simply killed something.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
Those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed. The bitterness of men will fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell is a very interesting place. There's a lot of people who would like to know what's going on. There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome, everyone, into Garden of Doom. And this week, we're sort of going to get back to our original roots. Because of the show's success and really the guest booking success and some of the introductions and friends I've made along the way, the show really got ahead of its skis and has gotten to a level of guests that I never dreamed I would get to in under 3 years of podcasting. And because of that very nice problem, the show's gone in a lot of directions, which I thought were amazing and awesome. And we've studied religions and theosophy and the history of languages, and we're going to continue to do all that stuff. But in the beginning, we were just going to go with the basics. And I've had shows on cryptids. I've had shows with casual conversation about Bigfoot back when Shah was my co-host, and with our good friend, for those of you who are in the wrestling podcast world, the legendary Kevin Castle. We've had 2 cryptid investigators. Chris O'Brien sort of covered everything paranormal. Actually, Ryan Musgrave Evans in Australia talked about cryptids. And actually, there was another gentleman in the Southeast. I am so sorry I forgot his name, but he's very prominent in it. So anyway, there's plenty of shows that touch on cryptids, but we haven't had a pure Bigfoot episode with a Bigfoot researcher that does all that. So I found Dr. Russ Jones, who he is the Bigfoot doctor. And I was so grateful that he responded to my query and said, sure, let's do this. So Dr. Russell Jones, who is a doctor of chiropractic medicine who's seen over 200,000 patients and hails from southeastern Ohio, but lives in West Virginia now and has done a lot of research and studies in those areas and beyond, I'm sure, and has his own podcast as well, has joined us. Thank you for patiently listening through the intro. As we both discussed, neither one of us is tech guys and understand we sometimes need to do things manually. But welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Jeff. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah. Please introduce yourself. Do a better job of your background and your expertise and things like that.
Okay. I'm Dr. Russ Jones. I've been a chiropractor for 31 years. As Jeff mentioned, I've seen over 200,000 patient visits. I grew up in Southeast Ohio and went to Indiana, Huntington College in Indiana, an undergraduate, for won a baseball scholarship, and then went on to Palmer College in Davenport, Iowa, which is where chiropractic was invented in the 1800s, and is kind of the Harvard for chiropractors, and moved to West Virginia after completing that. And so here I am.
Here he is. You know what? Even people who go to the Harvard of chiropractic have to drop that they went to Harvard. That's what I should say.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's the law. I went to Emory, and they used to say it was the Harvard of the South, but I don't drop it because it really wasn't true. Even then, Duke was the Harvard of the South. So maybe Emory is now. I don't know. It's been a while, but maybe I'll start dropping that too. I went to the Emory of the South. Maybe I should have done that 30 years ago, and I'd be more successful now. Anyway, enough about me. So, what got you interested in Bigfoot? I've listened to a lot of your shows, so I know, but of course my audience, let's not assume they've listened to your shows as well. And feel free to promote your show, your networks, the other shows, your co-hosts, anything you like.
Okay, so the podcast I do is called Wide Open Research. It's part of the Untold Radio Network, which is was began by Doug Hychek, which was the producer of Monster Quest, the hit TV show for many years. Mm-hmm. And so there is 8 of us on there, one each day of the week, and one morning show. And so, but what got me into Bigfoot initially, I grew up in Southeast Ohio. I came from a very outdoorsy family. Many people think that their families are outdoorsy, but mine was really outdoorsy. We all hunted everything that was in. We all dug ginseng. We all trapped. We all had coon dogs. We all had rabbit dogs. We were in the woods all the time. And New Year's Day, 1977, I was rabbit hunting. And New Year's Eve, we got about 4 inches of snow in Ohio. New Year's Day, I was out there with a friend of mine and our dogs. Came along a hillside, and up on this hillside, there is a cave that, you really can't see unless you know it's there. It's about 50 feet deep. And when I came along the hillside, there was these barefoot footprints. They were fresh. Whatever had caused them, created them, it came out of that cave. And I could see the toes. I could see it was about the size of a normal man. I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard of Bigfoot at this point in my life. It was 1977. Of course, 1967 is the big Patterson-Gimlin film, which is kind of the modern era of Bigfoot becoming popular at that point. But I thought that, it was the 70s. I thought maybe it was some type of vagrant or a guy that was, on drugs that were staying in this cave or something way out here in the woods. And so I went up there and looked inside and thought I'd find a fire, some clothes, and there was nothing there. And so we just didn't know what it was. Left there and didn't think anything more about it. Later that summer, I was at a beaver dam that was not one that anyone knew about. It was about a mile up of hollow. My family had found it because, we were, probably running our dogs and somebody found the beaver dam. Out on the front part by the main road, it was so narrow you could jump across it. But once you got back in there, it was about 4 acres and the fishing was unbelievable. And I had ran snapping turtle hooks, which for the people that don't know what that is, you put like a chicken gizzard on a big hook and a snapping turtle will swallow it and it holds it there and you can go and get your snapping turtle. And so I'd been there back in that area for many times. I was back there with my uncle fishing. It's very snaky, so we were both wearing pistols. And we were both standing on a dam, maybe 20 yards apart, and across the dam from me was this brushy. What's that?
How old were you in 77?
I was 12.
Okay.
I think 12 years old.
I think I was like 9, so we're a few years.
Okay, yeah, we're just a couple years apart.
I just want to talk for a second about the 70s, because I think it's hysterical that you were worried about hermits and caves. And for those people who are younger, which is probably 90% of the audience, in the 70s, we were led to believe that a lot of things were more dangerous and would be worrisome in our lives than that was. Like quicksand. Quicksand was like a real thing. Every TV show, someone fell in quicksand. Vagabonds, that was something of terror. And yes, we were led to believe that in caves and abandoned huts on the top of mountains or whatever, there were hermits and they were dangerous. And, sort of like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, were there to kill us and eat us. So these are not irrational fears that Russ is talking about. These were our urban legends before there were urban legends.
Yeah, it seemed pretty rational to me at that point, not if you don't know anything about Bigfoot and you find tracks in the snow that are fresh, that, it's 20-something degrees out and it's 4 inches of snow and something's barefooted. So, it seemed rational. Man on drugs, who knows?
Sure. Sure, absolutely. LSD also. I mean, in elementary, we were seeing those videos with elementaries with the people on LSD and PCP, and like they'd see train tracks, warning lights going in front of their eyes, and someone would be dead at the bottom of the pool, and they'd be saying, "You're a great swimmer," and things like that. And we went under our desks to protect us from nuclear fallout, which that would be what an amazing protective device that would be. So this was the 70s and the 80s, kids.
This is your brain on drugs.
That was the 80s, but that was a great one. The fried egg, nice.
So I'm standing back there by that beaver dam, and it's maybe 30 or 40 yards across to this brushy part, water. I'm standing on the dam, the brush is on the other side, and I'm looking, and I'm just fishing quietly, and I hear something coming down through the woods. I glance over, I see my uncle's looking. I just assume that it's probably a deer coming down to drink or something, but then I hear very monkey-like screams, bushes shaking, and I look at my uncle, and I'm like walking toward him, I'm like, what is that? What is that? And he's like, just look for a tree you can get to. Whatever it is has to come across water. And, we're intensely watching it. We just can't see through the brush. And it lasted about a minute. And then, now I know that was pretty classical Bigfoot behavior as we've observed it over the decades now. But at that time, we just kept fishing. We were woodsmen. We were raised in the woods. We were in there all the time. Even from a very young boy, I was out in the woods at night. To give you an idea, I know that I could never do this now, but back then, I didn't have to kill whatever I caught, which a lot of times was coons or foxes. I didn't carry a pistol. I carried a baseball bat because I didn't want to damage the fur of the animal. But when you're raised that way, you just didn't think anything of it. But as it became older and softer, I couldn't hurt anything now. But nonetheless, so that happened. We just kept fishing. We didn't think anything about it. Later that year, Leonard Nimoy had a show called In Search Of in the 70s. I saw an episode on Bigfoot, and it made me wonder, and I was curious. And 2 more times over the course of the years before I graduated from high school, I had found a track. One time with my father in that same general area, and another time a couple miles away when I was squirrel hunting, I found a track in a fresh clear-cut area. So I was always interested in Bigfoot, followed it my whole life, went to 4 years undergrad and 5 years of Cairo school, moved to here in West Virginia. Over the years, as my practice grew, I became a certified master naturalist. And for the people that are curious about, a lot of states offer master naturalist programs. Some of them are very average. Some of them are exceptional. West Virginia has one that, it's taught by a college professor. It's every other Friday night. It's 3 or 4 hours of lecture by the professor, whoever it happens to be on that specialty. The next morning, you meet for 3 or 4 hours in the woods, in a creek, whatever it happens to be, to discuss whatever it is. There's 39 classes. So there's a fern class, there's a snake class, there's a tree class, there's a bird class, there's everything class. And you have to finish it in order to be a certified master naturalist. And so once I finished that, I was kind of getting back interested in Bigfoot. And so I saw that there was this Ohio Bigfoot conference, and this is the world's largest conference. I didn't know anything about it. I hadn't heard of it. And I thought, well, I'm just going to go. It's a couple hours from me. I drove up there. Knew nobody, of course. There's like 300 people there. It's interesting, but there was some pretty weird people there, And so I'm driving home, and my ex is like, well, what did you think? And I'm like, well, I mean, there was some pretty weird people there. And she's like, well, Russ, I don't want to be mean, but like, you were at a Bigfoot thing. And I was like, well, that's true. So later that year, I Googled Bigfoot. And in those days, when you did it, BFRO.net come up, which is the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. And that's a show associated with Finding Bigfoot TV show, the only scientific research group. Really, there's a couple others now, but back then, that was the only one that was around. And they were having an expedition. So you pay several $100s, you get interviewed, you have to sign these non-disclosure forms. And then about, a few weeks before you're going to go, then they tell you the location that you meet. And so I thought, I'm just going to go. If they're weird, I'll bail. And so I went, and back in those days, Matt Moneymaker, which is the lawyer, the one that started the show Finding Bigfoot, and was also the starter of the BFRO, was there. And Matt and I just hit it off. And so that was about 15 years ago. And from that point on, I started doing the group's reports in Ohio and West Virginia. And 8 years ago, I wrote a best-selling book called Tracking the Stone Man. And ironically, right before you and I were on, I had finished all the last final changes for the second edition. I've worked on it over 260 hours and sent it to the publisher in this last 2 weeks. We've been back and forth. But today I finally did it all. It's all approved, and the press release goes out Tuesday. And then last year, I wrote a book. It was published in December. It was called The Appalachian Bigfoot. It was #1 on Amazon for 17 weeks. And that was the reason why the publisher went after me to do the second edition. But every time I do one of these, I swear I'm never doing another one because it's just so many hours and such a hassle. Jeff, I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, but there was one guy. They were talking about Bigfoot videos or something, and he's like, well, you kind of have to say it because, you got to have people buy your book. And I thought it was funny. So I added up all the hours that I had in writing this last book and then figured out by the money that I'd made last year, and I'd made 20 cents an hour. So I thought I'd better use of my time in the future.
Yeah, that's prisoner wages.
Yeah.
Or North Korean wages. Anyway,
yeah.
Either one, not below the minimum wage. So this is not a money grab. It's a passion.
Labor of love.
Yeah. Very good. So, a lot of people, especially on Twitter, just don't like math and don't like numbers. It doesn't fit into their narrative. Anyway, enough about their narrative. Let's stick to your narrative. So, I mean, your story is not uncommon. I mean, the details are, but a lot of people I've spoken to who are invested in the paranormal and become authors and researchers, etc., have some sort of childhood experience that didn't touch their inner child because they were already a child, but started this lifelong interest and devotion. Obviously, it didn't sidetrack you because you went to chiropractic medicine. You've seen, over 200,000 patients. That's not nothing. We know that you're not an old man, or at least I don't think you are, because we're around the same age. And those people who do think he is, I'm going to try to avoid the explicit on this one, so, screw you. Though if it slips out, it's okay. I can just put the explicit label on it. So, all right, so this was the start. You sort of went from, a tweener to somebody who quickly fell into the upper echelons of scientific Bigfoot research. So before we go any further, this is probably self-evident, and it probably sounds like a Dobie question, but what's the difference, and how can someone from the outside tell the difference between a scientific methodological approach to researching and studying Bigfoot versus everyone else?
It's a struggle, isn't it? I mean, so many things, so many different professions, so many fields of interest and hobbies that people have. Bigfoot might be one of the true examples that's being led by citizen scientists. I mean, we have a handful of well-known anthropologists or different types of doctors that are similar to that, PhDs that are interested in the field, maybe PhD wildlife biologists. But by and large, it's mostly people that maybe don't even have that kind of background at all that's doing the research. And the sad thing about that is, and I address this in the second book, The Appalachian Bigfoot, a whole chapter on just trying to motivate people to be more scientific in their approach, to look at things from a different perspective. And unfortunately in Bigfoot, a lot of the Bigfoot world, people are more interested in the experiences and the encounters they are, and they really don't care so much about the animal being acknowledged, or they're interested in they're going out at night and they want to have an experience. I largely don't even go out at night anymore because there's just no evidence to be collected. The scientific community isn't compelled by some of the FLIR thermal footage that's out there and that's apparent. Some of it's really good, but they're just not compelled. Quite frankly, they're not even that interested in it. So I think that there's a lot of groups that are around. If you look at the BFRO, there's Olympic Project out in the Pacific Northwest. There's the North American Wood Ape Conservancy out of Oklahoma and Texas. That by and large, those groups are the groups doing scientific research. And you have some individuals on their own. I don't want to, belabor anybody or belittle anybody with, not including them in that. But I would say that there's a scientific method, a scientific approach to how we are taking about it. For instance, probably my specialty is game cameras. I have over 40 professional game cameras in the woods in West Virginia and Ohio. I methodically keep notes all the time, everything that I do. I spend a lot of time in the woods. I mean, that's another problem. Let's say that Bigfoot was acknowledged. Instantly, the academics and the government officials would come out of the classrooms, and their offices would be in some location where a lot of us don't have access to. Maybe it's a watershed that no one's allowed to be in because it's serving Portland, Oregon, or whatever it happens to be, or Walla Walla, Washington. And they would put scientists in there for a long time that were getting paid to be there, and they would have some of the equipment that none of the rest of us can afford. That's one of the good things about the BFRO is you have a lot of professionals in there. There's a lot of different types of doctors that are in there, a lot of medical doctors. I'm the only chiro that's in there, but there's other types of professionals that have the disposable means that we have the expensive thermal cameras on our own. We're able to afford 40 game cameras, and able to, unfortunately, be old enough that I take enough time off work that I can manage all this. So I think that, a lot of people get interested in Bigfoot. I can't tell you the number of times, like last fall I took a sighting from some guy. And then I'd say maybe about a month ago, there was a school counselor that had another sighting, and they all get excited and they want to be involved in Bigfoot. And they're like, I'm going to do the show, or I'm going to do a YouTube, or I'm going to do this or whatever. But the reality is that you never really see anything most of the time. You're in the woods hundreds of hours. In fact, there's these two biologists that lived in Oregon named Hukin and Sullivan, and they had a Bigfoot encounter on the job there. And they were very active in keeping their notes for all these years. And they had this something called the guideline, the Hukin-Sullivan guideline. And it's for every 200 hours in your woods, you will have one type of sighting, brief encounter. You'll find some scat, you'll find a footprint or some evidence or hair sample or whatever it happens to be. And I have found that, that was in the 70s. It's evolved now. We know more now. And I would say that it's probably about half that, maybe about every 100 hours I can encounter something. So for me, that's about every other month. So if you think about it, I'm hiking these hills in West Virginia and doing all my game cam stuff. And the great majority of the time, nothing happens. But it's just time in the woods, and I like that.
Yeah. I'm new to Russ, but, once you start following, you see he does spend a lot of time hiking in the woods. So he's actually there. I am old enough to remember exactly what you remember. I'm of the age where Leonard Nimoy was famous to me first before I realized he was Mr. Spock. For older people, it was the reverse. For younger people, it probably is the reverse, so they never heard of In Search Of. But that was probably my first exposure to Bigfoot, including that film that is iconic now. Then there was Andre the Giant played Bigfoot, or Sasquatch rather, in the $6 Million Man show, which was, sort of hokey, but when you're 11, nothing's hokey. And then from there, Sasquatch was a character in the X-Men, in the Alpha Flight series, and theories
$6 Million Man.
Yeah, Steve Austin, the original Steve Austin, not Stone Cold. So the point of all this is that I'm long enough to remember when Bigfoot was like, sort of a big ape man. Is it ape? Is it man? Is it the big man? Is it the giant? Is it something hominid? To more lately, like the last 15 years, like now it's become something supernatural. It's interdimensional. Yes. It's alien. Yeah. It's got cloaking and invisibility devices. Yeah. Portals in and that. All of a sudden we've attributed something that was, plausible but rare of, some species of hominin, either in the Homo family or in the ape family, that hasn't been categorized as maybe very rare, has a survival ability to hide from man. I mean, this is not that unusual. I mean, we thought Tasmanian tigers were extinct. They found one 3 years ago alive. And I believe there was a snow leopard that they thought was extinct, and they just they spotted one alive. There was a type of a jellyfish that they thought was extinct alive. They found new creatures, alive all the time. This is growing up. Nothing lived in the Antarctic. Well, guess what? There's like an insect that lives off the Antarctic and somehow gets oxygen and nutrition out of like the oxygen bubbles in the ice. So, just to say, that's miraculous and extraordinary enough but to turn it into some sort of interdimensional, intergalactic being is something I don't subscribe to, and I know you don't either. So I just wanted you to take a second to address these things, because the people are expecting sort of a supernatural rather than preternatural being discussed here. This is not the show for you, though. I'm open to guests who want to talk about that, but that's not this show.
Yeah, so in my mind, it works something like this. Whatever Bigfoot would be, he was in either Africa or Asia. He came across the Bering Land Bridge into North America and then spread chasing game, territory and whatnot. The Bering Land Bridge was open 10 to 20,000 years ago. Many people believe that originally that maybe Bigfoot was something called Gigantopithecus. It was the largest ape, 8 to 10 foot tall. We have bones. There's fossil evidence of it. There was millions of them that existed. Then lately, some people believe that it's Paranthropus, which came from Africa. It's essentially a Bigfoot and looks like one. And the problem, of course, with that one is that we don't know if it came that far. There's no evidence of bones that it came all the way up through there.
How long ago did Paranthropus live, according to traditional science?
So it'd be an Australopithecine. So you're talking about a couple million years ago, but most of the Giganto and that kind of stuff most of the studies show up until around 80 to 100,000 years ago, which is relatively recent.
Yeah.
The problem with that, the Giganto one, is that it looks like it may have been all fours. The dental DNA stuff that they're doing now, the studies looks like it's probably was, something that just ate plant life or plant matter, maybe a bamboo eater. So that would have meant that when it came over, it evolved into being an omnivore here. So that's where Bigfoot would have came from. Now, in about the last 2 years, we've had this thing called woo. And woo is to sound like a ghost, but woo. And so there is a paranormal aspect that is becoming rampant in Bigfoot. And it's just in the last 10 years. I believe that it's because we've never had a time where people are in the woods so little. They don't know the trees. They don't know the ecology. They don't know the snakes. They don't know what happens there. They don't understand it. They're never there. They're just there. Maybe a couple, they take a vacation and maybe they go there. Or maybe a few times a year they go camping for a weekend or something. So people don't understand how the way it works and the animals that are there. So you have Bigfoot, if it existed, would be rare. It would be, if I was going to guess, maybe 4,000 to 8,000 in all of North America, something along those lines, which sounds like a lot. But when you start dividing it out, into provinces and states, choose Ohio, or West Virginia, where there would be like 150 to 175, and then you break it down, and then it's like a family group in a county. So you start thinking about a county being 30 or 40 miles in each direction, and somewhere along there would be something, if the terrain holds it, that for generationally knows where people go, where people don't go. And occasionally you have sightings that's more active at night, so people aren't seeing it that much. People kind of stick to the roads largely. I mean, there's a study from Outdoor Life, University of Pennsylvania State. They did game trackers on 1,000 hunters and found that, all but just a few, as less than 1%, were within a quarter mile of the nearest road or trail. So it's just not common for people to really be out there. I know I just recently did a radio show for somebody in New Orleans, and they didn't know anything about Bigfoot. We were just talking. That's what they called me for. And they're like, it just seems like that someone would have ran into it. I mean, somebody out there or whatever. And I was like, who's out there, man? I mean, I don't even see anybody. Right. There's nobody in the woods anymore. It's just not that popular. But I don't know beyond that why the proliferation of woo, but it's troubling because there's a lot of young scientists that are very interested in Bigfoot and the proposition that maybe something like Sasquatch could exist. There's evidence of it in other countries. Almost every country and culture has it. The Native Americans in North America have it going back literally hundreds and hundreds of years. Newspaper reports going back to the 1850s in the United States and the eastern U.S., so there's a long-standing history of it, in our country.
Yeah, not just our country, everywhere, as you point. I mean, all 6 of the populated continents have stories of something that is not exactly like a Bigfoot, or probably is a variation or a species, if that's
some type of something similar.
Yirin Yeti, Yowie, the orange ape man in South America. Obviously, our Bigfoot. I'm sure there's a million different names. I've had people from with African lore talking about that, and Asia talking about it. Even in India, they have their version as well. So certainly no surprise. So listen, I have nothing against Woo. I just don't think that Bigfoot is part of the Woo universe. Again,
me either.
I'm willing to listen to it, but I'm more thinking it's something from our anthropological past, probably in the human chain, or at least somewhere close to wherever our, related to our common ancestor with the chimps from, around 7 million years ago when apparently we split off or whatnot.
Yeah, it has to be after we split off, to be for the bipedalism. But, when Homo erectus had tool use, and of course, so it would be, something aside from that. So, or it could be something we don't even know yet. I mean, if you think originally, like maybe even 10 years ago, the argument was that, anthropologists always considered there could only be one animal occupying each space. And, we thought that, Homo killed out this, which killed out that, and it was this long chain. But now we know that it's just not like that at all. They just all existed in like kind of a bush. They were all there at the same time. They were interbreeding. Mm-hmm. Eventually Homo outbred them all, or killed them all, or whatever it happened to do. So
or intermarried.
Yeah, or whatever it happens to be. So, I mean, it's changed a lot. And so that's not really the argument anymore. There's really not an argument anymore. The argument that I hear, I done one TV show with an anthropologist that didn't believe, or not a TV show, but a podcast. And they would say that there's not any evidence, but frankly, they just really don't even address the evidence. They're just not interested.
Yeah, and leaving Bigfoot a little bit, but still on the subject, in the last 20 years, they've discovered at least 5 different variations of Homo, of something that would be Homo sapien, but not Homo sapien sapien, modern man, whether it's Denisovan, whether it's the Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi in South Africa was discovered. So, and they've, even about 3 or 4 years ago, the scientific community believed that there was Neanderthal DNA in Europeans and Asians, especially Eurasians, but not in Africa. Now, just a few years later, no, Africans have about 4% of Neanderthal DNA as well. Mm-hmm. And now with the discovery of Denisovans, we're finding out just how many people have Denisovan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I've heard it pronounced 6 different ways. DNA and that, and this is going to continue as we find more evidence. We dig deeper, we get lucky. Dragon Man in China still hasn't quite been identified. That, if you believe in giants, you think it's a giant. If you believe in Nephilim, you think it's a Nephilim. If you think it's a Bigfoot, you think it could be a Bigfoot. I mean, we don't know what it is at this point. They haven't been able to sequence it. It's I think it's just a skull. Anyway, the point of that is that science has changed so much just in 20 years. In fact, in material ways, in the last 3 or 4 years, that to rule this out entirely is probably a little bit silly. And I saw an article on scientists come up with a new explanation for Bigfoots, and this was posted. It was either science.com or Smithsonian.com, and I took the time to read it. And it was nothing new. It's the same thing they've been saying for years, that it's black bears standing up. Now, I've seen black bears, not in the wild, but my fiance has taken a photo of one and nearby, and I've seen them in the zoo and things like that. And black bear's a big animal. It's scary. I don't want to run into a black bear, but it's basically like a big Saint Bernard. And standing up, it would not be 7 or 8 feet tall. A grizzly bear maybe, but that's not what they're saying. They're saying black bears. And people know what a grizzly bear standing up looks like, because we all watch Grizzly Adams, and we're going to see Cocaine Bear when it comes out in 2 months. And we've all seen bears standing up in commercials and movies and whatever. They don't look like people. Pareidolia be damned. That's something that we're familiar enough with that we're not going to transmute that into a person or something like a Harry and the Hendersons type of, Bigfoot creature. So without further intentional meanderings from me, I'm going to let you pick it up where you left off.
So, I mean, just last year, best-selling book about Homo florensis, I forget, I was looking at my bookshelf. I read so much that I don't see it over here. I don't remember the anthropologist's name that wrote it, but there's still reports, and he believes that in all likelihood there might still be some over there.
Could be.
So, yeah, who's to say? I mean, I think it's dangerous to sweep broad swoops saying that certain things can't be or won't be. I mean, I think that, when you just consider the evidence for Bigfoot, like probably the most compelling or the convincing thing is the footprints, the casts that come out. There's hundreds of them been found. There's specialists that are anthropologists, PhDs that, like Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University, which is a PhD and is an expert in primate mobility and functional anatomy. You look at some of the footprint cast and you take, what do you say if you take the best 100 that are, they show functional anatomy, they show motion inside the joint. It's clearly not some type of fake. When you consider all those things, you consider, there's around 60,000 Bigfoot reports. It's estimated that about 1 in every 20 get reported. So there's 60,000 that have been reported. You take the top couple hundred of those and you're left with forest rangers, just taking the very best sightings. I think about like Action Jackson. Do you know who I'm talking about when I say that?
The Carl Weathers movie?
He was the renowned forest ranger from Yosemite, or Yellowstone, that just retired. He was in charge of the Yellowstone backcountry, the most expansive remote area in the United States. And that's where he made his living, riding a horse, protecting that country from those people. He just retired in the last year. And he's said that he saw the Bigfoot when he was there. So if Action Jackson, the ranger that did all that for years in the daytime, had a sighting, I mean, I'm pretty confident that he knows what a Bigfoot or a bear or whatever it happens to be looks like.
Agree.
So there's other reports like that, and I'm telling you, there's literally hundreds and hundreds that are exceptional reports. I remember one doctor was head of I don't remember now if it was the UCLA or the USC medical school, had watched one for 20 minutes when he was hunting wild boar. And I mean, there's all kinds of story after story after story. And I remember when I started doing this, I mean, I knew something happened. I thought that there might be something, but I wasn't sure. And the very first report I took was from the state trooper in West Virginia. And he was riding his four-wheeler with his wife on the back, and they were riding on a right-of-way. And we have a lot of those in West Virginia because of our coal-fired power plants. And a lot of animals use them. They create edges for game. Different types of plant life will be there than are found in other areas. And they're long, straight distances. They tend to not be around houses and whatnot. So things use them for travel. So he's doing that. Him and his wife like to hunt ginseng. And it's in the summer, but they're out looking for places they might look in the fall when ginseng, you're allowed to hunt it. And he said he pulled off this right away and he glanced up and he thought he saw a fire burn stump. And he kept putting along, and he glanced up again, and he paused, and he asked me, "Have you ever seen one?" And I said, "No." And he said, "They're so large, you can't imagine. Think a sheet of plywood." And he's like, "People disappear. I'm not saying it's them. They're just so big, you can't imagine." He said, "I'm trying to hit reverse, to put my four-wheeler in reverse." And my wife said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he said, "Look, look, look, look." And of course, he's wearing a pistol. And she looks and she screams, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And they get tearing out of there. She gets counseling for post-traumatic stress. They move from the country into the city, still saying that if she hears something outside the house, then, she thinks a Bigfoot just came into the town or something. I went out there with another investigator and took him and another state trooper out there, both of them chain smoking, holding their guns out the whole time. And the guy just crying and shaking. And I thought, this dude saw something. There's, clearly something has shaken this man. I went on another interview, a man that retired from NASA. He was the youngest sheriff in the history of Florida, retires to West Virginia. He's just putting around with a family friend that's a logger just for the ride, just to have something to do. And they're driving along a gravel road, and they look across a creek, and after a minute, he stops. The guy stopped the truck and he said, "Did you see what I saw?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "There was a Bigfoot that was knelt down on one knee drinking water with its hands." He said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I saw." And I have hundreds and hundreds of those stories just in West Virginia that are people that'll be, they'll call me and say, one gentleman called me and he said, he told me his name and he said, "You can Google me. I was a police commissioner and I was the mayor of this town. I want you to know that you can take me seriously, but I don't want you to use my name and I don't want you to tell people who I am." But he said, "I just am saying this so you'll take me seriously." But he said, "This is what I saw and I'm not mistaken."
Right. It's tough when you promise to keep confidentiality like a journalist would, and and you're dying to establish the credibility of your witness, but you really can't. But obviously you've heard a lot of them, and you sort of tried to take the chaff from the non-chaff, the boys from the men, so to speak, and done a pretty good job.
Even doing a lie detector test sometimes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, back when I was originally when I started taking reports, the very best ones, I would include different types of tactics like that, trying to accumulate the very best ones. I recognize that, when you talk to a lawyer or a judge or a police officer, they'll say, well, witness testimony is, it's terribly unreliable. It's renownedly unreliable. But I think that the thing that we need to look at is setting aside the Native American culture and those type of things that go back, talking about Bigfoot for hundreds and hundreds of years, that there are certain things that people are good at. So people are not good at guessing height or weight or how far away something is. They're really not good at that at all, I found. But the standard for knowing whether something is a human or not a human isn't very high. Like, I think most people, even people that have never been in the woods, if they saw a Bigfoot, they'd say, well, that's not a human.
Right.
And so we have to attach some weight to that Native American lore, Native American culture, going back hundreds of years, some weight to the, throw out the half of the Bigfoot things and say they were a bear, a misidentification, or somebody slipped and filled their head, or they're insane, or whatever happens to be, and just keep the 1,000 very best ones, or the 500 best ones that leave everybody shaking their head saying this is real. There's just no question about it. You just put those things on there. If we were in a court of law, they would find that it's real. But, we're talking about an undocumented species, so the standard is much higher, rightfully so. But unfortunately, we just don't have participation from the scientific community, like we would love to have.
Well, I can tell you as a lawyer that while what you said is absolutely true, you're also going to find very few prosecutors who are going to prosecute a case without witnesses. That cuts both ways. You want the witnesses? Sure. Are people unreliable? Can an expert sort of show where people have the weaknesses or failings, which are not their fault, some of which you just exposed. I mean, there's all sorts of studies on what we have problems distinguishing, and you noted some of them. But yeah, I think you're right. The difference between human and non-human, whether they interpreted it as a troll or an ogre or a werewolf or a Bigfoot, may be a distinction. But they confusing a bear, or a puma in a tree or something for a Bigfoot, that doesn't seem likely to me.
It's not so reasonable.
Yeah. Except maybe someone just absolutely panicked. But as you said, you can tell the difference between sort of trained observers, people who are taught to not panic under pressure, woodsmen, outdoors people, hunters. And again, the Native American lore, not just Native American lore, the indigenous peoples, the hunter-gatherers of every country, they encountered other animals. They had to, oftentimes they had to fight or share their prey with the hyena, the wolves, their jackals, or they had to wait for the bigger animals to finish and be carrion and be scavengers, whatever it was. They knew what a dire wolf was. They knew what a lion was. So enough of me for the moment. What I'd love to hear from you is, obviously you've categorized some credible encounters, and you've already mentioned a few. What are some of your top 5, besides the ones you've said, of credible encounters? Like, which stories got a hold of your imagination, and then you investigated and you said, yeah, this seems like it's something.
So I usually choose recent ones because I've done hundreds of them. And, in both books, I put a lot of the reports that aren't even in the public domain out there for people to read. So, they can find those in the books. But one or two that's not in the books that I would think about most recently was a school counselor from Southern West Virginia. It's a gentleman that, for the people that haven't been in Southern West Virginia in the coal fields, when you drive there, you're humbled by how steep the terrain is. You look at the trees and you wonder, how can they even stand? It's just unbelievable. But a lot of the people in that country are outdoorsmen. It's really common. And, if 20% of the people in the country believe in Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest or in Appalachia, the number's probably well over 50%. Almost everybody has a story or knows someone that has a story because everybody's out in the outdoors so much. But this gentleman, every year, we only have a ginseng season that lasts a short period of time. So if someone would dig a couple $1,000s worth of ginseng, that would be pretty normal. If you're digging 10,000, you're really in the woods a lot.
Right.
But for somebody that would find 10 or 12,000 in a weekend, that person would be exceptional. And that's the way this gentleman was. He was looking on maps and finding places where other people wouldn't go. And so he took his stepson. They walked 4 hours to get to a place where, he believed that there would be some ginseng. And of course, it has to be largely, a lot of times it's older, big forest because it likes this dark, gloomy area that's moist in order to grow the very best. And so when they walked out there, they were in an area that had been clear cut a little bit. And so then he got into this, he said, we were just dropping into this big dark hollow. And he said, as soon as we started to drop in, he's like, I thought I heard somebody laughing at us. And he said, we just paused. And he said, then I kind of heard it again, like it was laughing at us. And he's like, we didn't see anything. We didn't know what it was. And he said, so we kind of drop over the hillside. So we're going into this hollow. And he said, I could see something moving down there. And so he's watching, and he said, I can see it's something that's dark and it's upright. It's tall. It's around 7 feet tall. He said, it's standing behind a tree. And you hear that all the time. The patience that these animals have is amazing. Like, they will not move unless they've been seen. They're always behind something. And a lot of times they'll stand still or sit still for long moments, 20 minutes, 30 minutes without even moving. That's just inbred apparently in them, just part of who they are. But, he saw this and it started making noises, and he could see it breaking trees, and it would pull the trees down. And his stepson was 13. He was getting really afraid, but he's like, it's okay, bud. He's okay. And he had a pistol on him. So he said that, it's far enough away that the way they could see it, he thought that, it was probably okay. Well, they saw it kind of walk off and walk up this hill. And so he told his stepson, he's like, I want to go down here. I want to look at this area where it was. And he said he went down there, and, he could see other trees that had been knocked down over the course of time that he believed were probably from the same animal. But then he looked up the hill and he could see that it was up there against a tree stump. He could just make it out. And then he saw that it started rolling rocks down the hill and started moving around more. So they left and went out of there. They were nervous. You can imagine seeing or hearing something like that and having a 4-hour walk back out, and part of it being in the dark, when something's out there like that. But he's another one of those people, he's ate up with Bigfoot. He's interested in it now that it happened. But he would send me maps and say, look at this place. It's a 6-hour walk. Nobody can get there. All these hollows come together from these different counties. It's a perfect Bigfoot spot. And I'd tell him, listen, man, there's a lot more perfect Bigfoot spots than there are of the animal. It's a rare animal. And that's what people discount so much, is the rarity of it. That's why there's not that many sightings. That's why it's so hard, with the game cameras, for instance. I believe that, there's a lot of studies. The Chinese had a big study because they have some undocumented species in their rainforests over there. So they tested all the American game cameras. Their best camera is the Reconyx camera, and they're between $400 and $600 right now. And even them are about 20 decibels. But the cheaper cameras are 30 decibels. A lot of times children can hear them. And the University of Georgia had said that, they will notice they don't get alpha male coyotes on their game cameras. So a lot of the animals are leery of game cameras and must hear them and avoid them. So I think that that's probably part of the problem. So that means that we're left trying to set them up where there's a creek or some kind of noise covering the sound of our cameras. And, you're talking about the odds of something that there may be a family group in a county in a spot that's a likely area, a good place. And you're trying to get something to walk within 50 feet of that camera that it can probably hear.
Right.
So
right.
not that likely.
Well, yeah, I mean, but animals have stronger senses than we do. I mean, dogs, they can smell like 20 million times better than we can, or 60 million. It's some exponentially, it's unimaginable. It's so loud. But they can also hear in different, I mean, dog whistle. That's what dog whistle means. It means dogs can hear a certain tone that we can't hear. And dogs' sense of smell is their major smell. Cats and other animals have, more for their hearing. So, who knows what this creature has evolved, and different species have probably evolved different things for their environments over time, just like every other animal has. I have a few quick fire questions for you just to get some things out of the way that I'm curious about. Do Bigfoots have reflective eyes? You know how you shine a light on like a wolf or a dog or a cat and it reflects back? Does that happen with a Bigfoot as well?
No. So, what we're talking about is eye shine, that you see reflection. Of course, almost everything do. In the back of the eye, we have a structure called tapetum lucidum, which allows, things that want to see at night, it magnifies that light coming in so it can see better. So certainly, the woo crowd would tell you that they glow. And we do have some, I think it was a lemur or something, that there's some evidence that it was actually having its eyes that do produce some type of light. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, I haven't seen anything to evidence, to suggest otherwise. But, so did I answer that question?
Yeah. No.
Okay.
The answer is no. Okay. Do they hibernate?
I don't think so. I mean, most of the bears that we have in this part of the country are, torpor, which means that they kind of go in and out depending upon the weather. You have elk and moose and whatnot that live through the winters, and I don't see any reason why, a smart primate that probably would be our closest relative if it's to exist wouldn't find any problems with, getting by in the winter. I mean, ironically, in West Virginia, because it's so steep, you can drop a couple thousand feet quickly to get to a warmer place if it's a cold winter storm. Or you can find one of the 10,000 mine shafts in West Virginia that are abandoned that no one knows, that are just up on the mountainsides in different places, or caves, or whatever it happens to be. But, I mean, some of the reports we take, some of the very best ones, are in the winter at the high elevation. So it seems like it just probably doesn't matter to us. But, so no, I don't believe that they hibernate.
Okay. And is there any evidence that they use tools? Tools meaning anything as basic as using sticks to find grubs or worms or insects, to something, clubs, flint, hatchets, whatever, and anything that would count as a Stone Age or Wood Age tool. So the Stone Age really was more Wood Age.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how, our standards of this have kind of evolved and changed too. Recently we've seen the chimps using things to fish with and sticks and different stuff. But I know one time in the mountains of West Virginia, I found a large rock about the size of maybe a desk that was underneath a tree that was a beech tree loaded with nuts, and something had been crushing the nuts with a big flat rock on the larger rock.
Yep.
So I know I put a picture of that in one of the books and said, what do you know in nature in remote areas where no humans go is crushing beech nuts on a rock? So I don't think that they... I don't think that they use tools in the sense, that like early Homo did or something like that. But, we hear examples of them clacking rocks, and some people believe that they throw rocks to kill things or whatever that happens to be. I mean, that doesn't seem really unreasonable to me. So, there's some rudimentary evidence.
Or to use a rock to open a nut or a shell or something where they don't want to use their hands, or they...
Yeah.
Yeah,
or a mussel. They use freshwater mussels. They eat those a lot. I found a Bigfoot track one time in Ohio around a lake in the winter where it was after mussels.
Oh, that's great. I would consider that tool usage. I mean, it's rudimentary, and there are, as you said, I think, muskrats or beavers or something use. I'm sure plenty of animals do. I mean, but it's rudimentary tool use, but not much to glean from that. Okay, I had asked you to give some of the sort of the best, most credible stories, and you told one, and then I took you in a whole different direction. So let's U-turn and go right back to where we were, because I'm sure you had some other ones with some, credible folks that you rely upon and probably put in your book as well. But
Yeah, I took this one from this lady not long ago, just several months ago, and it was from East Tennessee Cherokee National Forest. Mm-hmm. And she was a high school senior. And after her and her friends had graduated, they're getting ready to leave for college. And so her and her friends, it was 2 girls, and then a group of people were coming up the next day. And so they checked in the ranger station and went up. And then to walk to the campsite was about a 15-minute walk. And so the girls, when they walked into the campsite, they heard this loud bang. And of course, one of the noises that a Bigfoot makes is a wood knock, is what it's called. But we don't know. Some of the apes in Africa, orangutans, mountain gorillas, some will hand clap, some will mouth pop. And, they're large animals with large hands, large mouths. So you can be pretty loud, I'm sure, because, you've heard people do that same thing. And, of course, then there's reports of them actually, someone seeing them actually hit a tree or something to make that noise. But nonetheless, the girls heard that noise and called out, hey, is someone there? They just thought someone was in the woods or whatever and didn't hear anything. And they were carrying stuff and going back and forth. And when they got done, they talked that each time one of them came back in there, they had heard that noise. And they fixed dinner and had a good night's sleep, and nothing happened. And the next day, it was about an hour and a half walk to a set of waterfalls. So the girls were being girls and having fun and talking the whole way there. And they ate and, came back. And they were about a half hour from being back. And one of the girls, her watch band, had lost the pin. And so the girl that was the witness told me, she said, this is really the first time we've been quiet the whole time because we were laughing and talking, but we were looking for that pin and we were quiet. And she said, we heard something laughing, and the trail they were on was surrounded by rhododendron. So it's very thick. It's hard to see, but there was a little creek that was about, maybe 50 yards away from them. And there was just a deer trail that kind of meanders over to it. But one of the girls thought that it was the people that had came early were trying to, surprise them or scare them or whatever it happens to be. So they heard that kind of laughing sound again. So the girl went creeping through there. They were both, hand in hand, and they got over there where they could see the creek and they could see something was there, but they just really couldn't see what it was. And they were still assuming it was their friends. And so she went over there and she stepped through. And when they stepped through, they said it was just like something exploded. Things went everywhere and they couldn't really see that much, but standing right in front of them, not 10 feet away, was this enormous Bigfoot creature in the creek in a half crouch position, holding so still. She said, we didn't even know if it was real. And she said that crouching, it was about 6 foot tall, but it was much larger than that if it would have stood upright. So they were standing there looking at it, and then they started hearing a clacking sound like something banging rocks together, and they looked over there and they couldn't see anything. But when they looked back, then the creature was bent back almost like in a matrix-like position backwards.
Right.
And it took the back of its hand and thrust it toward the girls, saying, "Mwah." And then it started walking backwards. And she said it was very creepy. And it walked backwards, putting one foot behind the other one, almost gripping the ground while it walks. And of course, Bigfoot researchers would know that's because they have a 2-part foot, a metatarsal break that, allows that type of thing to happen. And right before it entered in the woods, once again with its palm against its chest, "Mwah," throwing its hand out in them. And as soon as it stepped into the woods, it was just like the woods exploded. Trees were cracking, trees were breaking. The girls put their hands over their heads, and they thought that, things were getting ready to fall on them, but gradually it just disappeared and the sound went away as these animals were moving away. Apparently there was other ones over there the whole time.
Well, I have a bunch of questions tied to that. I want to ask them all so I don't forget them.
Okay.
First of all, explain more about that metatarsal, or whatever the word you use, break.
Yeah.
Is that what allows them to climb sort of like monkeys? And that signal, that, the reverse bridge and then the "wah," and with the hand gesture off the chest, do you think that was I mean you no harm, or go away, you've been warned, or what do you interpret that as? You can take them in whichever order you like.
Okay, so Bigfoot's feet look human-like on appearance. The toes are all straight in the same direction. But in the bottom of it, sorry, somebody was ringing me in here.
It's okay.
In the bottom of it, of the foot, it goes across. There's a break in the metatarsals, and so it allows the foot to be flexed. And so a lot of times in footprints, you'll actually see that part, whereas humans have arch. Bigfoot doesn't have any type of arch. And so when we look at the footprints, a lot of times we can see that. We can see at the base of the toes many times where they individually are in different positions or where they'll push off. And that's one of the ways, that we can recognize the type of structure. Also, the tibia and the fibula, the shin bone or the bone on the side of the foot for people that aren't, medically inclined, set forward on a foot than what you would expect to see on a human type creature. And it would have to be that anatomically just to accommodate the larger size and structure. So
does that help? So basically the meat of the foot can bend. It can flex. So
yes.
I may assume that that's useful in a lot of ways, including climbing and gripping.
Well, not necessarily climbing trees, so to speak, but probably like the terrain that they're on a lot of times. It allows greater contact. There's a little, like when you and I walk, we have a little straddle in our walk. There's a left foot and right foot. Mm-hmm. They have a tiny amount of straddle, but largely they almost tight line is what we call it. It's almost a straight line. It's because they're large, but they're following game trails and many of the forest or whatever it happens to be. And the feet are large, and they're padded really heavily on the bottom. Of course, there's, in terms of other, before we move on, let's just talk about, generally what they look like. Yeah. So generally they're reddish brown or dark collared, but they're kind of like a coyote. It's common to hear, blondish or grayish collars, things like that. There's hair everywhere with the exception of their hands, on the palms of their hands and the soles of their feet. There is very little hair on the face in most cases. They have longer hair, wispy-like, on the forearms coming off. You can see like wrinkles around the face or the eyes, very commonly like that.
Sure.
The eyes are, much larger than our eyes because, of course, they're on average much larger than we are. I mean, one of the interesting things that I think, not to go off so I don't forget about going back to that story, but, Bergman's rule in biology or ecology is that animals that are farther from the equator tend to be larger. So a deer that's in Florida is larger than a deer in Canada, and it's all about warmth and creating surface area. And so the tracks, as we have them now, of course, we don't have that many to be able to say for sure, but there's not enough data. But it suggests, since the 70s, that the tracks follow the same way, the same rule. The tracks that we found in Canada are larger on average than the ones that are found down south in the United States on average. And this type of thing is consistent with what you would expect to see with a real creature as opposed to something that's not. So it's hard to imagine people that are hoaxing tracks. I mean, some of the tracks are found in insanely, like they're found 8 mile walk in Sierra Nevada wilderness area. It's hard to imagine somebody being in there making Bigfoot tracks. Places that normally you wouldn't expect to see a human. And of course, I always tell people, well, I'm there, so someone else could be there as well. Of course, the odds are not likely in some cases, but, then if you find a footprint and you start looking at it and it has all those things that you and I are talking about, and then the comparatively on the anatomy that, say on average, the average Bigfoot footprint is 14 inches long, that I think it's compelling that, that the hoaxers, there would be enough hoaxers. I know that one, Dr. Grover Cranswith was an anthropologist at Washington State University, which wrote a couple of Bigfoot books. He talked about that it would take about 1,000 hoaxers in the course of a year in order for them to reproduce all the footprints that have been reproduced. And not only that, then you have to make sure that, if they're just a wooden foot thing stomping in the ground like the guy out west used to do that faked tracks, his name was Ray Crow. Everybody can kind of see that looks silly, versus, you see a footprint in the mud and one toe's going one way and another one's going another way, and you stand beside it and you can't get your weight to drop in at all, but its weight does. And then you measure it relative to the size and it matches up with other things. But nonetheless, so back to the story, the girl asked the other girl, she said, what was it? What was it? And so the one girl walked over and there was like a rock overhang right there in the creek. And she noticed that there was a bunch of dead crawdads laying on top of it. And she said, we disturbed them. And so the girls had that 30-minute walk back, and the girl that was telling me the story, she's like, the whole time she's crying, Jeff. She's sobbing. she hasn't told the story but one or two other times in her whole life, and it happened when she was 18. I'm talking to her, and she's in her 40s.
Oh,
and she said I could tell that her friend wasn't doing well. She's like, she's having trouble breathing. She threw up. She's like, we had both peed when it happened in our pants. And she's like, I can tell my friend's ready to have a panic attack. And so she said, we got back to the camp, and she said, I thought we would just say, but she's like, you got to get me the F out of here. She's like, now. And so she's like, I got all my stuff. And so they just carried as much as they could one trip as they went and left. And when they got to the bottom, the ranger station was there. And she said, well, we had to tell the rangers. And so before she could say anything, the other friend had just ran in. And when she went in behind her, she's like, she just sounded disturbed. She's just like, monster. And, she didn't know what it was.
Right.
She's like, it's a monster and this and that and whatever. And the ranger's just staring at her. And he says, we don't have any type of old vagrants or anything like that living in the woods. You saw a bear. And the girl that is relating the story to me, she said it's so silly to listen to him say. It was just so preposterous. And so the other girl just ran out. So she told the ranger that, that they were leaving or whatever. And of course, there were no cell phones back then. And so she drops her friend off, never sees her friend again. The next day, some of the men that were coming to stay with them went to the area phone and called him from the phone booth and said, are you guys okay? And she's like, why? And she's like, he said, when we got there, the camp was tore up. They had, you remember the Coleman metal tables that kind of latched together in a big silver square?
Yes, I do.
And it was still latched, but it was completely twisted. And every other thing was broken. And so he brought it to her. And she said that she went to just an area grocery store and threw it all in the dumpster because she was so troubled. And not very many months later, the other girl committed suicide.
Oh, it's terrible.
Yes, it's very terrible, traumatic. And so that girl lived her life, and she was pretty successful. She raised children. She moved to another city. She was in Philadelphia at the airport, and she ran into that girl's brother. And as soon as hadn't seen him since childhood, and as soon as he saw her, he walked up to her and said, what happened to you guys that day? She was never the same after that.
Just triggered.
He just thought, the family thought that because she wouldn't talk about that, maybe they'd been raped or, something along those lines. And so she said, I just started sobbing and trying to tell him the story of what happened. And she said, he just looked at me and said, what am I supposed to do with that? What am I supposed to tell my parents?
Yeah.
And so she told me the story. I wrote the story up and sent it to her. And she's supposed to come on my podcast here in the next few weeks. I'm not sure whether she'll be able to do it or not, but, she seems better now that she's told the story and read the story, and maybe with some time and distance has become comfortable with it. But I told the story because it was a terrifying story. It made me think about how I would handle myself being in the woods like I am and something like that happened. And would I have handled it any better than she did? And I can tell you the next day I was in the woods and I was a little punchy when I'm walking. I was paying more attention than what I normally would be paying attention when I was in the woods. But that's just a story from a normal person. It doesn't mean that, we have hundreds that are from, lawyers, doctors, all the other stuff, and, that are outdoorsmen as well, and rangers and that type of thing. But, sometimes, like even here in West Virginia, some of the witnesses I may have an accent and they sound a little funny, but they're woodsmen their whole life. So maybe they hunt bears and that's what they do. So when they tell you that they saw something that was not a bear, it's compelling and believable. And once again, it needs to be taken with a little weight. You can't just discount it because it's witness testimony.
Are there any from, say, Army Rangers or Navy SEALs or anything like that? Because, you think that, they've been under high pressure. They're trained observers. They're patient observers in a lot of cases, a lot of waiting while, active waiting. I would imagine that, some law enforcement is different than others, but maybe SWAT or whatnot. Do we have testimony from people like that? Listen, I love doctors and lawyers. I'm in the unquote air quote professional class, but I'm not sure that my testimony of anything I see in the woods is worth a darn. I would trust your woodsman who's lived there their entire life.
Yeah.
Assuming nothing like tragic happened where they needed to make a money grab. And I'm not sure you can get a money grab now. There's easier and lazier ways to find money grabs now, but just saying, are you sure the government meant that? I mean, big.
I mean, what is the advantage of that? Jeff, why do witnesses come to me, and they're not all like this, but many are, that are prominent, respected people that own businesses or whatever it is, and will come to me and tell me a Bigfoot story with the understanding that they don't want me to tell anyone who they are. They have the ability, they could be on Finding a Bigfoot TV show if they want to, and people kind of know them and stuff or tell their story, but they don't want to. Yeah. So why would you, why would you do that?
Yeah, exactly.
If it wasn't true.
You want to unbury your soul. You want to talk to somebody about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a certain percentage are disturbed or mentally ill, but, I mean, I'm sure that, there's hoaxes. I mean, I've found many, many hoaxes myself over the years, people talking to me. I mean, probably in the last month, there was one or two that I didn't believe. I talk to witnesses each week. You're just nice and tell them that you'll include it in your research and you appreciate their time or whatever. But, just like anything else, I'm sure that with lawyers or certain types of people, when you're getting a jury or something, you want in there. And it's the same way with witnesses. There's certain things that we're looking for and we want in a witness. Some are historical things like, there was a medical doctor from Ocala, Florida, that he was 70 and he had a Bigfoot encounter and he wanted me to know, he'd thought about his whole life. So him and his dad, if you got time for another story.
Sure.
Him and his dad are, he's a young man, he's in his teens, and every year they would go up to hunt near the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, and it was a tradition of theirs, and there was a little cabin they stayed in, and a pasture and an orchard there. And so he said that when they went out, they really didn't notice anything that seemed unusual. They did notice that all the cattle were in one part of the field, but they didn't think much of it. So they were walking over to where they were getting ready to go into where the orchard was, and his father said, squat down. And so he said, I see something up there. I think it's a bear up in the corner of that field. And so his dad looked through his scope, and he said it looked like for a long time. He said it was probably a minute he was looking through that scope. And then his dad said, look through up there and tell me what you see. And so he looked up there and he said, what I saw looked like a kindly old black gentleman that was up in the corner of the gate looking down at us. And they both looked up and watched it for several minutes, and then it disappeared. And he said, my dad said, come on, let's go back to the cabin. And so they went back to the cabin. He said, his dad was a man's kind of man, a big hunter and all this. And he says the only time in his life he ever saw his father afraid. And he said for the next day, they both kept their guns loaded even in there. And any time that they had to go to the outhouse, his dad would stand on a porch with a loaded gun to make sure everything was okay. And so, his dad had asked him, tell me everything that you remember about it and what you saw. And he told him the, description I gave you. And he said, that's exactly what I saw. And he said, son, this is a secret to be kept between you and I, and let's not share it. And that's the end of it. And so he didn't tell the story until after his father had passed away.
Well, that's
so, hear things like that stick with people. Like I remember there was a blacksmith here in West Virginia. I have a picture of his drawing in the book. And I asked him if he would draw me a picture. He said he did sketch of it. And I said, well, can you send me a copy? And he's like, sure. And he sent me one. I was like, I'll get it back to you. And he said, nah, I have hundreds. So it's something that sticks with these people, that they aren't able to get past it. That's like me, being a woodsman my whole life and growing up around that. I have a farm in Ohio that I bought largely because it adjoins a park where there's Bigfoot sightings. Right. I practice in an area because I knew I'd be able to have land and be able to go to the woods quickly. Some of it has shaped our life in terms of, the need to figure out what it was, that we have ran into. And it's, I think it's romantic in nature. I like to believe that there's still things out there for man to discover, and I just want us to go about it a certain way, to take the subject seriously, to approach it from a scientific manner.
Well, you're an Appalachian real estate mogul as well, then. as it turns out. I have a few, we'll call them parting questions, I think, because you never know.
Okay.
And again, I'll ask them so they don't forget them. what do you think a Bigfoot is, and are all the cognates the same animal, just different species? Yeti, Yerin, Yowie, Bigfoot, Sasquatch. What are your thoughts on the 1967 film, which got debunked, gets rebunked, gets debunked, and it's had a renaissance? And this is probably a two-part question. What do you think the best portrayal of a Bigfoot is in pop culture, the media, and what's your favorite? Because those may be different things.
So everybody talks about the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that was the one in 1967, the one that everybody has seen, probably one of the most iconic pieces of film in U.S. history. Everybody knows that Bigfoot's walking along, turns around and looks at the camera. It was two guys that went out there that were interested in Bigfoot. They're riding horses. They see it. The one guy jumps down, continues to do it. The other guy splashes through the water, and that's when the Bigfoot turns to look to see where they are. And that's called the Patterson-Gimlin film. Okay. Patterson died of lymphoma not long after that. The other guy, which never got anything but grief in his whole life, Bob Gimlin, I think he's 90 now. I've had breakfast with him a couple different times and talked to him and find him believable. I mean, there's whole books written on the subject. Bill Munns wrote one when James meet Patty, Harry meet Patty, or something like that. It's exhaustive in the research in it. There's really very little. Bigfoot is one of those things that normal people are living your life. You got a wife, you got kids, you got a job, you got your house, all this stuff that we're all doing. And everybody might have an interest or a hobby they're doing that they know something about it. But, Bigfoot is an unusual one. So there's just not that many people that are keeping up with all the research that's out there regarding Bigfoot. And rightfully so, everybody's busy. But it's weird because everybody has an opinion about Bigfoot. Even the people living in towns will tell you that they haven't, whether or not something could exist or not exist. And sure. I know on Instagram, sometimes I'll go in the store and I'll ask people, I'll say, can I ask you a question, for instance? They'll say, yeah. I just got one question. It's not bad. Do you believe in Bigfoot? And instantly, everyone has a big smile. Everyone. It doesn't matter if they believe, they don't believe, whatever. They all have a big smile because it's the monster we all grew up with, and everybody knows what a Bigfoot is.
Right.
So I don't think there's any question that the Patterson-Gimlin film is real, and there's naysayers and whatever it happens to be, but the reality is when there's an educated person talking about it, they just get shot down. For a deep dive, the podcast Astonishing Legends did a 7-part, I think it was 7 parts, maybe 6 parts. So it's like 6 hours long just on that. On the Patterson-Gimlin film, you can go in there, it's exhaustive, but if it's your deal and you're interested in it, it proves, once again, like so many things do, that it's a real deal. Now, I'm going to say that there's a recent book that came out called The Freeman Bigfoot Files. There was a researcher in the 70s named Paul Freeman. It was controversial. And he was this forest ranger, and he was patrolling this water creek shed that provided water for Walla Walla, Washington. No one was allowed in there, maybe elk hunters like a week a year or something like that, and they patrolled it. And he had a Bigfoot sighting and got interested and started collecting tracks and stuff and got some footage as well. And it became controversial because of how much he got, but it really wasn't that much. And the book came out recently, and I had the honor of going through it and helping with some of the editing or whatever, just light stuff, and going back and seeing the old interviews and all that stuff and some of the new footage, enhanced footage now that we can do with digital stuff to be able to look at it better. Now I'm convinced that footage is one of the best footages that's out there as well.
Okay, excellent.
I'm sorry, Jeff, I don't remember what else it was you asked me.
Probably the more serious one is what type of creature do you think? Do you think it's an animal, a primate, human, hominid? And do you think that all of the different variation, the different names around the world, I use the word cognates, that may or may not apply depending on your answer, but the Yerin, the Sasquatch, the Yeti, etc.
Yeah.
If it's all Bigfoot, if it's all the same, maybe perhaps speciated, but do you think it's all the same, and what do you think it is?
I don't research the ones in other countries, but it's hard to imagine it isn't all related, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of, it's interesting when people say things like, we say things like Bigfoot is a primate because, we're primates too, right? And it's really a broad term. And we're saying Bigfoot's a hominid, and that's true too because it's a really broad term. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's the easiest thing for it to be would be Gigantopithecus or an offshoot. That's the most, as one of my friends would say, parsimonious ways for it to be because It's already in place. All the things happen. It's already existed. We know it's there. We just don't know for sure whether or not it was here. Now, keep in mind, like, how many years does it take for a fossil to come about? It's, on average, it's around 10,000 years.
Oh, okay.
So how many years ago was the land bridge open? 10 to 20,000 years ago. So
or longer.
Probably whatever came over, there's not fossils here. It hasn't been here long enough.
Yeah, and when people say land bridge, apparently, I mean, it was a bridge at some point at the end, but it was like a continent. It was, Beringia. It was like a, it was a full continental shelf.
Yeah, during the Ice Age, things could travel across from Russia to Alaska, and largely they were coming up through Asia to be able to do the same, and that's how most of things got here. Now we're seeing some of the, I think it's the Catalina Islands off California, that we're seeing that some of the things may have come a little earlier, that they were coming along the water, with canoes.
Everything keeps getting older.
Yeah, it really does. And there's more things that we find that all the time. It's so interesting how humans always think that we know so much. Say, like, take the spotted owl. The spotted owl is rare. We're going to protect the spotted owl, and we shut down all this timbering, we do all this stuff, but we also put out all the forest fires, and so what happens? It goes extinct because what humans did. We find out later that, it needs secondary growth. Well, we do away with all secondary growth. That's where it nested at. Right. But humans, we always have good intentions, but, we're just not that inclined to understand how our history works and the planet works around us. So, I think that's in the end, that there's a lot of evidence that something could possibly be out there. And the people that take it serious are just saying that, let's just pause and say that, maybe we don't know everything. Maybe something could be out there, and, let it be at that.
Okay. So you're non-committal, but definitely primate hominin.
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, that's, it's such a broad term that almost anything fits in, but yes.
Well, that's fine. Listen, that's fair. That's prudent. And then the last one was, what do you think the best portrayal in the mass media of Bigfoot is? Generally, I mean movies, TV. And what's your favorite if they're not the same?
The thing that really bugs me is you've seen all those little statues they have everywhere, like they have them for yard arts and all this stuff.
Of course. And
they have this apish nose with a nostril sticking up. And that's just not the way that Bigfoot is, because that's the way that something like a gorilla would be that's in a rainforest, that it's trying to get rid of humidity. Bigfoot has a covered nose, a flattened nose that's larger and human-like, but like kind of like a boxer's nose, more pushed down, which makes a lot more sense because, it's trying to keep the air warmer that it's taking in, something you expect to see in this type of species. So I'm annoyed by the representations that are so popular. Do I have any of those statues? Yes, everybody gives them to me for all the time, and they're in my house and my yards and everything else.
You're not an ingrate.
Yeah, exactly. There was a movie, I'm trying to think, it was called Letters from the Big Man.
Okay.
And it originally became popular as an independent movie, and it gained some traction. And I think that the creature that they had in that movie looked real and was pretty representative.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can find that movie, Letters from the Big Man.
Yeah.
And so that's the best and your favorite. So
yeah.
All right, very cool.
Yeah, I like it.
Tell the folks again about the book that's coming out, second edition.
Yeah, so
and where else they can find you and support you.
You can find me, my webpage is called thebigfootdoc.com. You can find my books on there. You can find my podcast on there. I'll link to it. You can follow me, like I met Jeff, on Twitter, the Bigfoot Doc. It's not the Bigfoot Doc, it's just Bigfoot Doc. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, West Virginia page. I show a lot of techniques for collecting DNA evidence on there, and I put a lot of reports on the West Virginia Bigfoot page. Has a footprint on the top. Easy to find, so if someone would like to tell a story or whatever, I'm always game for hearing one. I just did one before I talked to Jeff.
Excellent. Well, I can't thank you enough for being on here. Finally done.
Oh, it was great, man. I appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you. I've been meaning to do a proper Bigfoot show for a while, but it's been more theoretical rather than reaching out. And it didn't take a lot of reaching out. You were generous with your time and said yes, basically right away. appreciate it. I've enjoyed your show. I've enjoyed some of your colleagues' shows as well. So I wish you well. Hopefully we'll keep in touch, obviously, on Twitter. If you can stick through all my ridiculous wrestling chaff. That's what I use Twitter for. This big smarty pants has been watching wrestling for almost 50 years now. So I guess that says something about me. I don't know. Anyway, and I'm not going to stop. Shut up. I don't care. Don't judge me. Or do. Anyway, so thank you all for tuning in to Garden of Doom. You're definitely going to hear from us again next week. And thank you for your ratings and your reviews. And most importantly, your referrals. Thank you again, Dr. Russ Jones. And we'll listen to you all again next week in the Garden of Doom.